Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's July 21, 2020, and today we're speaking with two journalists at Frontier Myanmar. The first is Ei Ei Toe Lwin, the Chief Election Correspondent, previously Chief of Staff at the Myanmar Times, where she worked for over a decade. Hello.
Hello.
And Ben Dunant, Managing Editor at Frontier Myanmar. Hello.
Hey, Luke.
And Dr Gerard McCarthy, Post-Doctoral Fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Hello.
Good to be with you.
Now, we'll be discussing the upcoming November 8, 2020 elections in Myanmar today, and this is the first of two Myanmar Musings conversations. In this episode, we'll focus on the big picture, and then in a second episode closer to the election, we'll focus on the nitty-gritty of the contest and developments along the campaign trail. So, let's quickly set the context first. Over 90 political parties will contest this election, yet one of the two major parties will likely end up securing majority or minority government. So nearly all observers believe so far that the National League for Democracy will win. Maybe we can start with you, Ei Ei. Who are the NLD and what is at stake for their victory in 2020?
The NLD would retain a majority seat with the popularity of Aung San Suu Kyi. And then, NLD seems confident it will win the upcoming election, though the party leaders admit it may not repeat the 2050 landslide victory. Most of the party's members, those are actively participated in 1988 uprising. So they lead the government, but their performance is not good enough. And people, they depressed because NLD could not meet their expectation. So people think NLD popularity is declined, and so they will not get a massive to form government in 2020 election.
I think what Ei Ei says is very important because the NLD came to power after the election 5 years ago with incredibly high expectations. You know, this was a party that had won a landslide election in 1990, was not allowed to assume government, became a kind of underground opposition for about 20 years and was then gradually allowed to re-enter the political process, starting with a by-election in 2012. And that meant that, 2015 was like the election in which you had this military proxy party in power that was going to do battle with the NLD, which was this sort of national grassroots dissident movement. And because the NLD's goals were always fairly kind of vague, people projected a lot of expectations on. So I think it was fairly inevitable that people were going to be disappointed. But at the same time, there has been an economic downturn. The NLD says that they were going to prioritize the peace process, which, made some progress under the previous government, the USDP government. But under the NLD government, it's like really made almost no progress whatsoever. The NLD's big pledge was to change the constitution, which it cannot do because the armed forces, they control 25% of parliament, and you need 75+% of parliament in order to change the constitution. But I think it's important to say that although there's a lot of disappointment, that hasn't necessarily translated into support for rival parties. I mean, sort of something that I hear quite a lot, particularly in Yangon, is people sort of expressing disappointment in the NLD, talking about how optimistic they were feeling in 2015 and how they feel now. But at the same time saying, well, we don't really have a choice. There isn't really a viable alternative because, the biggest opposition party, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, is really a party of retired military service men and is incredibly tainted by that past. And I think that there's very little appetite really to vote for them. So there's that sense that there's not a real opposition or not really a credible one in most parts of the country, except in the ethnic states where you've had ethnic minority parties that were quite split and divided. and failed to really capitalize on their base in 2015, because I think there was so much excitement about the idea of the NLD winning and what they might do. And the fact that in the last 5 years, I think parties have been able to consolidate. There used to be, multiple Mon parties, multiple Kachin parties, and they really unified. And they did fairly well in 2 rounds of by-elections in 2017 and 2018. So you have 2 very different kinds of elections now. In the Myanmar majority regions, you have an election in which there's really no viable opposition, whereas in the ethnic states, you have races where it's actually very hard to predict who will win. And in that sense, the election will be more exciting.
The second party that you've started discussing there is the Union Solidarity and Development Party. Gerard, who are the USDP and what is at stake for their victory, as unlikely as Ben makes it sound?
Ben's context is useful for understanding sort of how the party's evolved since 2012 and its sort of current political stakes. The party kind of was born out of basically a patriotic association, a mass kind of organisation in the early 90s, which was basically one of the ways that the old junta would try and organise people at a village and local level and ward level across the country for its various projects, and also collect information and surveil the community. And so that organisation had a lot of investments and businesses that were linked to it that were established during the 1990s, and which continue to bankroll the party now to a certain degree. The party then sort of converted from this sort of patriotic association come sort of welfare association in some ways. Ahead of the 2010 elections, it became a political party. And during that period between 2010 and 2012, it was basically an alliance of kind of military and military-linked business people. And sort of the broader kind of veterans networks that operate and exist at a local level around the country. Since 2012, and the by-elections were until she was elected in the vast majority of those seats, many of the commercial elites, kind of the old guard from the 1990s who kind of built commercial empires, many of those have left and abandoned the USDP and shifted their allegiances to the NLD, both at a local level, in terms of backing local candidates, at a kind of township and at a state and region level, but also at a union level, national level, ahead of the 2015 elections. So the USDP sort of now left as this sort of curious old guard of sort of military-linked families, sort of rusted on sort of civil servants, and a sizable base that have sort of grown up and come of age and relied in some ways on the network's social and material that the USDP's and USDA, its predecessor, provided to them. So, I think there's an interesting question about what kind of election 2020 is. We've had 5 years of the NLD government where expectations were, extraordinarily high. We've had a number of corruption charges and proceedings against high-profile members of the NLD. The peace process is stalled. And, of course, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, which has had very devastating effects for many kind of ordinary voters. And, there's scope there for, opposition parties, including the USDP, to build campaign platforms that would appeal to the material needs of people in this particular context. I think there's an interesting question there about how they kind of calibrate what their messaging looks like, and whether it is going to be this old sort of combination of military loyalism and sort of religious populism, which we've seen in the last few years, or whether there might be an opportunity for the USDP to appeal to a rural base, for example, disenchanted with land grabs and debt crisis and now economic recession as a result of the pandemic. The stakes of the elections do look different, and I think we can't write off the USDP as an electoral force of any kind, because there is an apparatus that continues to exist across the country.
But what I would say is that, after 2015 and their rather humiliating defeat, there was, I think, a question of where they could go, but like, could they reinvent themselves as like more of a populist kind of right-wing party in a sense that like could be recognized around the world, you know? And I think there was some attempt to do that, like when the Rakhine crisis was really spiraling, they tried like a bit of saber rattling, you know, to say that the NLD was weak on national security, was favoring Muslims and so on. And they definitely tried doing that with like them and a few allied parties, but it never really seemed to gain much traction. And I think Aung San Suu Kyi deciding to defend Myanmar in the genocide trial in December at The Hague at the ICJ, the case brought by the Gambia. The fact that she personally decided to go there, I mean, that was sort of criticized internationally, but domestically, that was hugely popular. And that was also kind of like checkmate in terms of the USDP, because I think the USDP could not really accuse the NLD of being soft on nationalism or soft on defending the country if, you know, Aung San Suu Kyi like kind of literally flew over to the Hague to defend the country in a genocide trial. But I'd be interested to hear from you, E. Like, do you think we're underestimating the USDP? Like what did most people think?
Yes, if we talk about the USDP role in 2020 election, we have to think about of the emergence of the new political party. So many people assume that so founding new party with the former military general can split a vote in 2020 election. So two new political parties were formed by the former General Thura Ushuiman. He founded a party named Union Betterment Party, and another former general, Soma, he formed a Democratic Party of National Politics. Local political analysts, they assume that so this kind of founding youth party founded by the former military general could split votes for the USDP in 2020 election.
So here's a tricky one. I just want to throw this question out there. Given the USDP had the first civilian, in quotation marks, electoral term, and the NLD has had the second, would it be better for the institutionalization of democracy and of elected civilian government in Myanmar if the USDP won in 2020?
I mean, what I say is the NLD winning in 2015 was really crucial to the overall transition process, being accepted domestically and internationally. And I think that's, I mean, although there were some problems with the 2015 elections, those were all dispelled by the NLD's landslide win. And I think it's a bit hypothetical simply because I find it very hard to conceive of the USDP winning. But I think, you know, it could possibly have some benefits in the sense that I think the fact that the peace process achieved more in the last government, you know, was probably had something to do with the fact that, you know, the peace process was being led on the civilian side by the USDP. And the military, you know, which holds a lot of the levers in the peace process, did not begrudge giving a peace process victory to a USDP government, but possibly reluctant to grant a peace process victory to an NLD government. So I think so narrowly in terms of the peace process, then I think that it possibly could progress further under a USDP government. But I think in many other sense, I think just the fact of the NLD being there is just like such an important symbol for, you know, a credible election process, for, you know, the people being able to express their preferences and so on.
I agree with your point. Yes, so they can do to gain good results in the peace process. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that from a purely democratic theory perspective, you know, you need two parties at least that are credible alternatives for voters. And the challenge at the moment is that the USDP doesn't appear to be that party that can appeal both to lowland rural constituencies as much as it does in ethnic constituencies as a party brand. And I think Myanmar needs at least two parties that can contend for, provide a policy program that makes sense to people and actually responds to the needs that they face. And so, I think that Myanmar's democracy is ever going to be poorer until there is a viable opposition party or a coalition of parties, which is more likely. I think there's a possibility that the stakes of the election could shift to a more local focus, and that the repudiation, as you're sort of imagining, of NLD rule, sort of wholesale. I think that's probably unlikely in terms of what traction USDP candidates might find at a local level. As with any kind of candidates, I think probably at a local level, we're going to see a lot more of kind of candidate-oriented sort of campaigns. I would expect that you see candidates who have a strong background, and we're seeing this already. The USDP is already sort of deliberately recruiting folks who could have been NLD candidates in another world, but who maybe have a military background, and there's a certain sort of possibility for them to be reformers within the USDP. And we've seen this in a few constituencies which I follow in sort of lowland central Myanmar, where the USDP is actively recruiting people who are kind of considered to be a bit more reformist oriented, who wouldn't necessarily go out and outright condemn the NLD, but certainly would be running on the basis that they're sort of well educated, sort of open to progressive kinds of reforms, and that maybe that particular area of the country needs another party to represent all the interests of people. So, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to see what balance of candidate-oriented versus party-oriented campaign we see from the USDP. But I'd wager on seeing far more focus on the individual candidates than we do for the USDP party more broadly at a local level.
And in a big picture perspective, isn't that a great thing, given the way that the NLD campaigns?
Well, I mean, I think there's an interesting question there, right? Like, what does how does the NLD big brand, even in 2015, what was the limits to that brand at a local level in terms of the nature of the candidates?
I mean, I think that's a really good point about things moving in a more local direction, like quality of local candidates and what that individual candidate means to the voting community rather than their party label. And I think, unfortunately, there are certain structural impediments to the development of a more meaningful local kind of politics. And that's because, the system of government is still very centralized. You have different state and regional governments. However, they're all appointed from the Naypyidaw. So, and that leads to very stark and disappointing results for ethnic parties. In 2015, ethnic parties as a whole did not do very well. However, the Arakan National Party, the main Rakhine party, did very well and emerged as the largest party in the Rakhine State Parliament. They won a plurality of seats. However, at the same time, the Rakhine State government is appointed, like all the other ones, from Naypyidaw. It meant that the entire Rakhine State government was NLD, and that was really resented because a Rakhine party, that same Rakhine party, but under a different form, also won in 2010. But then, you had a USDP government imposed from above. And in 2015, they had a convincing win and then had an NLD government imposed. So interestingly, when the NLD was proposing a lot of changes to the constitution, and then there was a failed bid in parliament this year when it was all voted down by the military, so there weren't any changes in the constitution. The one that the NLD didn't pick was a reform that would allow state and regional chief ministers to be chosen within the states and regions, and they be allowed to form the state and regional cabinet. So that reform would allow, if a Rakhine party does well in the Rakhine state, then, the Rakhine party would control the Rakhine state government, and a Shan party that did well in Shan state would be able to control the Shan state government. Interestingly, therefore, it was the USDP that then took up this cause, so amending Article 261 in the Constitution to allow chief ministers to be chosen in their own states and regions. And then they took that up as a separate initiative in Parliament that was voted down by the NLD. And it's sort of hard to imagine, a real kind of local politics that's more about the individual state and region if at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if a local party does really well, the state regional government is just going to be imposed from above, from Naypyidaw, either NLD and USDP. And I think that sent a pretty devastating message, particularly in Rakhine. And I think in Rakhine, you have the worst armed conflict that you've seen in several decades. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that, a lot of Rakhine, I think, understandably, are very disillusioned with democratic politics because twice they've, handed an election victory to an ethnic Rakhine party, but it just didn't mean anything. Like they might have most seats in the Rakhine parliament, but they can't really do much to kind of counter a state government that's imposed from above.
I think that's a really good point, and I think it's really important that we keep that in that element of the elections and the peace process in mind. That the question of ethnic disenchantment with the democratic process and disenchantment with and disillusionment with the democratic process more broadly across the electorate is something that we really need to kind of factor in. Is there a sense that the people who are being represented are actually representing the interests of their constituents? And if ethnic parties and ethnic constituencies, feel that their voices can't actually be translated into any kind of substantive political change at a union level, or are feeding into a process of constitutional reform that leads to federalism, then you begin to enter into pretty dangerous territory in terms of what are the avenues or outlets for expressing political aspirations. And it's that the question of disenchantment is a really big one for this election moving forward.
So 2015 election, ethnic party, they was defeated by the majority vote or NLD. After that, they tried to change their strategies and policy, and they trying to combine into one party instead of spreading so many ethnic party in one state. For example, like so many ethnic party in Kachin, Shan, and Cayenne as well. So now, the NLD, people expect win less than 50% of seats, and so ethnic and small party collectively secure over 25% of seats. And then, with the military continue to hold 25% of seats. In such a scenario, the ethnic party will take initiative in forming the coalition government with the NLD. But present, ethnic party hold only 9% of seats in the union parliament. So it is it is unlikely they can win 25% of seats. And I'm not sure ethnic party will even contest 25% of total seat or not. So that we will wait and see the response of the ethnic minority, whether they will vote for the ethnic party or not.
It's going to be really interesting to see how these party mergers kind of translate into what the campaign looks like, who the candidates end up sort of being, but also what these parties are pushing for from a federalism perspective, because there's often great diversity between these ethnic parties, many of whom ran in 2010 and were founded by high-ranking members of the armed forces who happen to be from ethnic backgrounds. Those parties were quite well institutionalized in some ways at the 2010 election, and then contested again in 2015, often with quite strong campaigns. And the merging of those parties, which sort of have is not much doubt that there's an acceptance that much of the Constitution, the 2008 Constitution, was accepted by the senior leaders of those parties at the 2010 election and in many cases the 2015 elections. And how those parties, which come from and were led by former members of the armed forces, that then, how do they merge with parties that are affiliated with or closely aligned with armed groups, for example, which are far more critical of the constitution, far more critical of the government, and now highly critical of in some cases, of the NLD as well. So I think there's an interesting question here about what the party internal kind of dynamics look like. And I think there's also, to come back to this question about what the stakes of the election look like as well. The theory of many about ethnic parties at the 2015 election was that they split the vote. The reason why ethnic parties did poorly was because they ran, 2 or 3 ethnic parties ran in one seat and they split the vote. But when you do the maths on that, at the 2015 election, there are very few constituencies across the country, less than 10, where ethnic parties, if you added up the vote from all of them, they would come anywhere near what the NLD received at the 2015 elections. So the theory about vote splitting, etc., doesn't really land when you kind of sit down with, as I did with many people, and I'm sure Ben and he did as well after the 2015 election. So why given you're in an ethnic area, did you support the NLD? And in many cases, it was an idea of national transformation. That NLD is the vehicle for both condemning decades of dictatorship, but also provides us an opportunity to transform the constitution and transform the country. And I think that the stakes of this election now, 5 years after, down the track, is just very, very different. And I think we're likely to see more of a localised campaign where the very limited progress on federalism and on the peace process is going to be front and centre of the ethnic campaign and of the critique of the NLD. And I know good contacts of mine who I've been following for some years, parliamentarians who are from ethnic backgrounds within the NLD, share that frustration as well. And so I think there's going to be an interesting question here about how the appeal of voting for an ethnic party that is merged now, but which has a sharper critique of both of the 2008 Constitution and to some degree of the NLD, how much traction that's going to get with ethnic voters. I think that's going to be interesting to see.
Before we move on to COVID, I think we should briefly talk about the UEC, the Union Election Commission, and the way that is set up. It's entirely appointed by the president, and its term basically corresponds with that of the elected government. So with each new government which is voted in, you get a new UEC, you get a new Union Election Commission, the entirety of which is appointed by the party that wins. So you have an obvious problem there in that opposition parties are not going to trust that UEC because it's completely appointed by the party that won. And I think you can talk about the different personalities, the fact that beforehand he had a very big personality in the job, but at the moment the Chief Election Commissioner is like kind of a nobody.
Yeah, so Union Election Commission led by UDNE under the President U Thein Sein government. So, as my experience, he could deal with well with the civil society and also media and so political party as well. At the time, we got a chance to interview with him about the rules and regulation of the electoral process and also restriction imposed by the UEC to the political party have to follow. And for me, I got a chance to interview with UDNE, and so the way he handled the electoral process was really transparent than the current election commission, because we don't have enough information from the current UEC. We are really difficult to get information. Even if we want to add something about the particular issue, no one can give answer from the so current UEC. That is the really important for us to have free and fair election, and we need support from the UEC.
This is a real test of election administration, and both in the sense that it's a test of the NLD's capacity to deliver an election where, Wu was basically responsible for the image of Myanmar's democratization in many ways, right? I mean, and I think he felt that, and the senior USC staff felt the burden that a failure at the 2015 election would be viewed as whether Myanmar had actually had a free and fair election, and whether the military had been sincere in its transition in handing power to a civilian government or not. And so obviously that state looks a little bit different now, where you don't have a military government. You have, a civilian government led by Aung San Suu Kyi, and with a far less high profile and informally powerful election commissioner. And you've also got a tricky context, right? It's not easy to pull off, voter registration, the campaign, the conduct of the poll in an open and transparent manner in any context, especially in a country as geographically diverse and politically vexed as Myanmar is, but especially in this context of the pandemic, where it's going to be a really interesting sort of question of how they just functionally, logistically run an election across Myanmar. So I think there's that element of the institutionalization of the election administration. And I think that remains to be seen, and it's a high degree of difficulty, I think, in many ways. But I think there's also something to keep in mind, and I think it's really critical to place in the centre of the conversation in regards to Myanmar's politics is how engaged people actually will be within the electoral campaign and in the elections broadly. We did see quite a high turnout of around 70%. Of registered voters at the 2015 elections. But that was lower in some ethnic minority areas. In some contexts, less than 50% of registered voters turned out in ethnic minority areas, which, was a significant sign even then that, ethnic voters, for a wide range of reasons, were, perhaps disengaged or engaged at a less intense rate than folks in lowland areas. So I think this will be it's going to be an interesting challenge in the context of, how the election administration and the political parties engage voters, and the systems that are put in place around policy platforms, for example, that can meet the needs and aspirations of voters in different parts of the country, and then how the election administration actually looks in different parts of the country to ensure that people can logistically get out to vote. And in the context of COVID, that's a tough ask, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how they rise to that challenge in the next few months.
Yeah, and voter turnout, not just COVID, but also conflict. But let's start with COVID. So, as said earlier, the election date is November 8th. It's a little under 4 months away, and it means that, the Myanmar election will be, like the United States, a COVID election, and like Singapore's, that's where you are, Gerard. So it's playing turmoil all over the world. But what about in Myanmar, in the lead up to preparations and to the election? Will this election always be remembered as the COVID election, or is the virus kind of unimportant in Myanmar to the event and outcome?
The health impact is seemingly minimal, or at least very hard to trace. I mean, there's a tiny amount of testing. So the actual path of the virus, which we know is circulating to some extent, is anyone's guess, really. But, there is an economic crisis. There's been a lot of layoffs. About 80% of the workforce is in the informal economy. So it's actually pretty hard to get good data. But there have been some surveys that have shown that the economic conditions are actually quite grim, and there's not really a functioning welfare state in Myanmar. So most people have really gotten very little help from the government. There was a handout of food parcels over Thinjan, And there's a cash transfer program, which is only now just getting underway, although they talked about it for months. So any kind of actions or moves to compensate people who've lost their jobs, they're very belated and they're very slow. So most people are on their own. However, the fact that there's not been a health crisis means that the country was only locked down for a short period, and a lot of commerce has restarted, and the parts of the economy that are really suffering are those that are relying on exports, so garment factories selling clothes to Europe, or people selling agricultural produce to China. So it definitely has had a toll, but it's very much like more of an economic crisis than a health one. And with regards to the election, I think that there's no question that an election can take place. They can definitely do it. The question is what kind of election? In Singapore recently, you had an election in which a lot of the campaigning was online. It was called like an internet election. I mean, that wouldn't work to the same extent, simply because it's a predominantly rural population that can be reached to some extent by the internet, but not all. And really, I think a lot of the really important campaigning in Myanmar is kind of face-to-face. It's sort of small-scale canvassing and so on. I'm sort of reasonably optimistic that it can go ahead and people should still be able to reach voters. I mean, one thing that they won't be able to do maybe so much is often the way that parties would campaign when they go to a village is there's this sort of oddly formal thing that they do where they go to a village tract administrator and they're saying, we want to do a campaign event, can we use the local monastery? And then village tract administrator talks to the monk and then ask all the villagers to kind of be at the monastery at a certain time the next day. And then the candidates turn up and then give a speech to 60 people who are assembled. And then the next week it'll be a different party doing that. That kind of campaigning might be more difficult, but the more sort of traditional kind of canvassing could probably still be done.
Maybe more directly on whether there are official restrictions in place on social distancing and on limitations to campaigning and how that would affect things.
Well, at the moment, the restrictions that are in place was that there is a ban on gatherings of 5 or more people. This is not really enforced. You can sort of go around the city and people gathering in large numbers, but it still is formally banned. And obviously, candidates want to play by the rule to avoid being disqualified. And it's currently not known whether this ban will be sustained. The UBC's answer is that it's waiting for guidelines from the Ministry of Health and Sports, and those guidelines would come at the end of the month. And until then, no one really knows. It's kind of slightly hurting the abilities of parties to plan. But basically, at the end of this month, some guidelines should be in from the Health Ministry, and then we should know whether these current restrictions and gatherings will be lifted for the campaign period, which lasts for 60 days. So that will get going in the 7th or 8th of September.
Yes, as Ben said, government not allowed to gather about 5 people. And so so UEC last month, they announced political party, they do campaign for the party's activities. But it does not mean about the candidate campaigns. Prospective candidate, they want to get the detailed information and regulation and guideline from the UEC as soon as possible, so that they need to do something for their campaign. So the problem is they concern whether they will get fair campaigns rules and regulation compared to the government. So they concern if they're not allowed to do campaign outside, so how they can do online campaigns or other things, and whether they will get equal right to speak out their voice on state-owned media and state-owned newspaper. So COVID period is really important for the candidate and also also important for the election result. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that there's it's going to be an interesting test of election administration, and the voter registration campaign is going to need to be sort of reimagined to some degree to ensure that people aren't overcrowding, etc. indelible ink is going to be difficult to justify using, and will need to be replaced in some way. But I mean, I think when you kind of take a larger picture, I think that COVID really should be the major theme of the election in many ways. I mean, Myanmar is in the middle of probably the worst economic crisis since the Depression in the 1930s, which reset, Burma's political development throughout the 20th century.
Right.
You've got 80% of households have lost income. The majority of businesses have laid off, workers, reduced hours, and scores of businesses have shut entirely. And the horizon line for recovery for the garment sector, for tourism, is mid next year, through to at least 2021 or potentially 2022 before you return to pre-COVID levels. And people are really suffering. There's been supports like loans and tax exemptions to the 20-30% of the economy that's formal sector, but the vast bulk of people have been sort of hung out to dry. And I think the big question is whether if Myanmar is truly a sort of a democratic country where representatives respond to the material needs of voters and listen to where the pain points are, that COVID, this should be the COVID election. Most other countries in the region, Thailand, Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia have spent huge percentages of GDP. Singapore spent 20% of its GDP on COVID economic and social response. And even then, many people have been left out in Singapore. And Myanmar has really tried to spend as little as possible, and most of that money's gone to the formal sector. And so, in some ways, this is a really sad test of Myanmar's democracy. And I think it looks likely that this is not going to be a major plank of the major parties about how they provide support to people who have been accruing worse and worse debt already, even before COVID, and are going to find themselves in catastrophic situations if they're not already. I hope that the NLD has more up its sleeve, and you would hope if democratic institutions function in the way that they should do, that parties would be listening. They'd be drawing up platforms and policy frameworks and trying to figure out how they respond to the needs of people who've been rendered destitute, who were already in a tough place before COVID.
Right, and in other countries around the world, their next elections will be basically COVID referendums. Were the citizens of the country happy with the way that their government managed it? So in Myanmar, will COVID be a campaign issue in that sense? Is there stuff the USDP can go for, sink their teeth into, failings in the NLD's response? Are there things that the NLD can champion?
Genuinely, the government has been quite triumphalist on triumphant on the subject of COVID, because they've looked around the world and they've seen, very developed countries that seem to be buckling under the pandemic. Their hospitals are filling up. The same could not be seen here in Myanmar. So the government is feeling rather pleased with itself, and I think there's a kind of civic pride here in Myanmar. I think a lot of people in Myanmar are quite proud of the fact that, the scenes you're seeing in the US or Brazil are not playing out here is a cause of a certain amount of national pride. Just sort of talking to local people, a lot of people sort of say very complimentary things about the government. They say very complimentary things about Aung San Suu Kyi, who has really been face of the COVID response. She started a Facebook group when the government began, Facebook page, personal Facebook page when the government began responding more seriously to the pandemic. And on virtually daily basis, she's been sort of leaving these messages that are really pretty light on details and don't really reveal that much of the government's plans, but are more kind of motivational in nature. They're about, we need to have unity, we need to be strong, this will pass soon. You should pray more, you should concentrate on the things that make you happy. So that has been kind of quite effective in giving more of a kind of human face to the government. And I think people probably have found that quite reassuring. But what I think is a bit of a conundrum is how a certain amount of pride in the low health impact in Myanmar kind of coexists with a very real economic impact, with people losing their jobs or being laid off or seeing their businesses go under. I mean, that's a bit of a puzzle. I mean, how would you explain that, Yi? Do you think most people think the government has done a good job, even though it isn't helping them that much in terms of their income or their businesses?
Yes, Bibe, they are very positive response of the government so against COVID. Because the government, they provide complimentary food to the people, and also they can do tax without paying, and also the facility quarantines. Most of the people share their feeling and experience on Facebook, and so they certified with the government so arrangement even in the quarantine center, so that so government so they will get a positive achievement regarding the COVID protection plan.
What we might do, since we don't have any time, is defer the recommendations to our hopefully our follow-up chat in a couple of months. And what I would like to do to send this off is to ask each of you 30 seconds each. Gerard, what will you be watching most closely over the election campaign?
Very good question. I think as someone who studies political economy, I think it's important where the money comes from. How do elections and campaigns get funded in Myanmar? And what kind of influence do the people who pay for elections get for the money that they give to parties and to candidates? This is one of the hottest issues that no one talks about. It's usefully avoided by almost all political party representatives I've spoken to. Money politics is at the core of Myanmar's electoral system. There's basically no regulations around private donations to political parties. So business people and companies can make basically undisclosed contributions to party offices at a township level, state and region level, or union level. This is a really problematic relationship between candidates and parties and Myanmar's economic elite in a context where Myanmar is on track to have one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world, spends very, very little on social spending, and you've got kind of stabilised this very negative equilibrium. And one of the things I'll be watching is where the money comes from to fund political campaigns. And I have a strong passion and have a piece coming out in an edited volume with some other colleagues about the elections, where I'm arguing very strongly that Myanmar needs public funding for political parties because of the really negative, corrosive consequences that relying on private business people to donate to your party or your campaign, what it does to the kinds of policies that we see. And we see land grabs, for example, around the country at a local level and at a national level, continuing to remain unresolved. And I argue that this is a major factor, that many of the old economic elites kind of entrenched in these land grabs are continuing to sort of find their way into the good books of political elites who feel anade to them because of the donations that they've received from these commercial elites. So I think that's going to be the most important thing for me, watching the money politics.
Excellent. So for Gerard, following the money. Ben?
Yeah, I share that interest. I think campaign finance is not talked about nearly enough, and it's incredibly important for the reasons that have just been said. But I'm going to follow the conflict in Rakhine, which I think will really impact the viability of the election in Rakhine State, because the Union Election Commission really is a big building in Naypyidaw. The way that the election actually gets implemented at the local level is by using the local government structures, the local branches of the GAD, ward and village tract administrators. It's basically those guys that do a lot of the heavy lifting. And it's precisely this kind of local level, village level government structure that is being dismantled and chased out by the Arakan army. I mean, it's generally a lot of civil conflict in Myanmar does not disrupt these structures and maybe tries to co-opt them or extract money out of them. But because this violence is so much more severe in Rakhine, you have village tract administrators who are resigning or running away. You're basically having local government falling apart in Rakhine, and the Arakan army trying to institute parallel civilian structures. So I think that raises very serious question about whether it's even possible, let alone safe, to hold the election in very large parts of Rakhine State.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we couldn't get onto conflict today, just not enough time. And finally, Ei, what will you be paying the most attention to in your election campaign observing?
So equal right for all minority and ethnic people to contest in the election. So that in 2015 election, most of the Muslim candidates, they were rejected to contest in election, and also most of the Muslim people, they didn't get a chance to vote for what political party they want to. So that because so under the NLD government, I think so UEC, they will follow rules and regulations to create a free and fair election, and so they will consider to let all minority people, including Muslim people, to contest if they meet criteria of the candidates. So that is my main concern for the election campaign.
Thank you. And also incredibly important, one thing we haven't talked about is that hundreds of thousands of Muslim people who were born in Myanmar have been pushed out of the country since the last election. But that brings us right out of time. So I just want to say thank you so much to the both of you, Ei and Ben and Gerard, for coming on to Myanmar Musings. I wish you all the best in observing the elections for the next few months, and I can't wait to talk to all of you again.
Yeah, goodbye.
It's been a pleasure, Luke. I look forward to chatting again.